Well, hello and welcome. My name is Richard Eng. I am the lead pastor here at Bethel Evangelical Free Church, and just want to welcome you for joining us on live stream. If you're watching live or if you're watching later, want to welcome you as well. I put on these monthly webinars because I want to equip lay people to think more deeply about their faith, think about how faith integrates with other areas of life. Last month, I had Hillary Ferreira, and we talked about Marxism for an hour. And if you can believe it, that was a very intriguing conversation, even though on the front end, you might think, oh, come on, that's not going to be very interesting. But we had a good time. And so we bring on different guests for different topics. But the purpose of it is to equip lay leaders, parents, people who are interested, students who want to grow deeply into their faith, and specifically two things: to one, understand the times, and to live faithfully as a witness. And this comes from two key texts, and I mention this every time, but it bears mentioning again. That Chronicles 12:32 says, of Issachar, men who had understanding of the times to know what Israel ought to do. You have to know what you believe and why you believe it in order to have wisdom. And 2 Corinthians 5:20 says, therefore we are ambassadors for Christ, God making his appeal through us. And so want to continue to think through how faith interacts with all areas of life, that we might understand the times, be able to respond to objections, or just for ourselves to strengthen our own faith, to become more informed and wise and be better ambassadors for him. So today I really have a special guest. Last fall I went to San Diego, and I've talked a lot about that trip because it was very impactful. But I went to ETS, which is kind of get all of the evangelical people together in the same place, and it's always a good time. But after that, a friend of mine, Tyson James, put on a conference, kind of a post-conference for that, and I got to spend some time on breakout sessions and some main sessions with different people. And that's when I spent a little bit of time with my guest here today, Melissa Cain Travis. And so she spent in her seminar talking about what we're going to do today. And I just thought, man, I got to get her on. So it's going to be a good time. But Melissa, why don't you spend a minute? Just thank you for joining us. And if you want to introduce yourself a bit.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited for our conversation today. So, just a bit of brief background on me. I am a science and religion scholar, if you had to label my wheelhouse, but my interests are broader than that. I love intellectual history, and I love the interdisciplinary nature of the science and faith conversation. So I'm interested in the history and the philosophy and the theology and the science and even the art, the literary art and the visual art that are all interwoven in this grand story we have of the rise of modern science and how Christianity played a role in that. I have just returned to the faculty at Houston Christian University, where I am serving as an assistant professor of apologetics. So I'm excited to be back among colleagues who I treasure. And I've authored a few books, contributed to a few books, and I live in a northern suburb of Houston, Texas, with my husband. We just celebrated 27 years of marriage, and we have 2 adult sons and a big fluffy cat named Kepler, after my intellectual hero, Johannes Kepler.
Awesome. I love that. I love that. Yes, yes. And so we have some ties there of Houston Baptist or Houston Christian now. So it's very good, very good. Well, you think about what I love about your background is you are interdisciplinary. And so what I appreciate about how you present about the science and kind of the background of all of this is it almost feels C.S. Lewis-esque. And I know that's quite the compliment. But what I like about you is you like to pull from different things and show how they all point in one direction, right? So uh, just to kind of kick off our conversation, what got you started thinking through this in kind of an interdisciplinary way, right? Science and all of your sort of exploration that way.
I really love that question. Thank you for starting with that. I'd like to give a little bit of background to help make sense of my answer to that. I
Yeah.
grew up in the public school system in rural North Carolina back in the 80s and early 90s. That's how old I am. And for anyone who's gone up through K through 12 in the public school system, especially during those decades, you know that subject matter was very compartmentalized, for lack of a better
Mm,
word. You know, you went to first period and studied English, you went to second period and you studied math, and you went to third period and studied science, and so on and so forth. And so you contrast that with what today is called the classical model of education, where knowledge is presented in a deeply integrated way, where we see how truths of mathematics relate to truths of artistic beauty, and those relate to philosophical truths, and so on and so forth. So when I finished my K through 12 education, none of this was on my radar. I did not even have a concept of what it meant to study intellectual history, what it meant to have an integrated understanding of reality. And I went on to do an undergraduate degree in biology at a Christian university that styled itself as a liberal arts institution, but it really wasn't, at least not in the classical sense. It was more compartmentalized subject matter. And really, the only reason they called it liberal arts is because they required you to take 2 semesters of Western civilization. And I guess they thought that justified using the phrase liberal arts.
there you
So I
go.
did an undergraduate degree in biology. My plan had been to go to medical school, actually. I was very interested in biomedical theory, if you will, but it was during my sophomore year in my undergrad program. I happened to read an autobiography by an emergency room physician, and it terrified me. And I had this epiphany that, oh, yeah, I love the science and the theory behind medicine, but I do not have the stomach to practice medicine. So I was
Sure.
already almost halfway through an undergraduate degree in biology. I didn't want to change my major and set myself back. So I thought, well, I'll just finish out this biology degree and then I'll go to work in research or something while I figure out what I want to be when I grow up. So that's what I did. And my husband and I got married my senior year in college. And then when I graduated, I did as planned. And I went to work for a research lab at Baylor School of Medicine down in Houston, Texas. So we relocated during that time. And this was sort of like being tossed into the deep end of a swimming pool, because I was out of my cultural element, having done K through 12 and an undergraduate degree in rural North Carolina. My little college town did not even have a stoplight. That's how small it was. So then all of a sudden, I'm in this big city working at one of the premier medical centers in the world. And I'm surrounded by all these highly credentialed scientists who are doing research and diagnostic work and all sorts of things. And I'm still this idealistic 22-year-old girl who wants to share Jesus with everybody in the lab. And what I discovered was that I was very ill equipped to have those kinds of conversations with people who were not, who had not grown up in the faith, or who had left the
Mm,
faith, and who were very entrenched in a scientific materialist worldview. And so over
sure.
the course of a few years, I ended up leaving Baylor after a short time because I got an invitation to work for a biotechnology company. And I had the same situation there. Lots of highly credentialed scientists, some of whom would ask me questions about how in the world I reconciled faith and science. that set me on a course of some self-study. And my self-study was still very compartmentalized. I was really interested in how do we reconcile scientific findings with the core doctrines of Christianity. And that was all well and good, but it was such a small part of the picture. I had so much more to learn. But a long story short, I could talk for our whole time together about what step led to the next and so forth. But
Sure.
long story short, I ended up doing a master's degree at Biola University in science and religion. And it was during that time that I first discovered a great love for the history and philosophy of science. These were topics I had never been exposed to. Even doing an undergrad degree in biology at a Christian university, no professor had ever talked about integrating knowledge in that way. And so, because I discovered this love of the history and philosophy of science and what that meant about the relationship of the scientific enterprise to the Christian faith, I decided to pursue a PhD in a program where I could become as interdisciplinary as possible. And I found a PhD in humanities at Faulkner University, but it was a great books program. So for any of our viewers who aren't familiar with the great books canon, the idea is that this is, loosely speaking, a canon of work that spans from ancient philosophy up to the mid 20th century-ish. Philosophy, history, literature, science, psychology, and so forth, that have been the most influential works in Western history. And so going to Faulkner and studying the humanities in a great books program, but with a philosophy concentration, allowed me to pull all of those exciting threads of the science and faith conversation together. So I was able to look at the relevant intellectual history and then to ask more penetrating questions about why Christian Europe was the context of what we would call the scientific revolution in colloquial terms. Or in other words, why was it when even Eastern cultures were doing work in mathematics, were making catalogs of astronomical observations, why was it particularly in Christian Europe that the scientific method was born, and we made great strides in a relatively short amount of time with the giants like Nicholas Copernicus, Johannes Kepler, Sir Isaac Newton, Galileo, and Robert Boyle, and on and on and on. And so that was what my research focused on. And Johannes Kepler ended up being the very centerpiece of my interest because, to use his phrase, the idea that doing science was, in a manner, thinking God's thoughts, that captivated me in a way that nothing else did. And I thought, I'm going to pull on that one thread and see what happens. And that set me off on a very unique trajectory of academic interest. And I've sort of been building on that in one way or another, in one direction or another, ever since. And so that's where I am now. And it's just a really joyful thing to me to find connections to new disciplines, one after another. So one of my more recent interests is actually something that is referred to now as the science of human happiness. So this is an emerging field, actually, even in Ivy League institutions. And these classes are among the most popular classes for undergraduate students to take at these
Wow.
secular schools, because they want to know, well, what do I need to do to be happy? Because after all, isn't that what everybody wants? Everybody wants to be happy. And so as I've investigated this phenomenon, this emerging field that they're calling the science of human happiness, what I'm discovering is a really interesting intersection with philosophy and Christian theology, and I could unpack that. But that's my current area of research, sort of my pet project, if you will. I'm hoping to
Yeah.
develop a class along those lines sometime in the near future, actually. But all of that to say, yes, I am an interdisciplinarian at heart, and I'm always looking for ways to become even more so.
I love that, and sort of finding the solution to compartmentalized education through just finding connections. And I love that that's how God kind of wired you. That when you find connections like that, you just keep pursuing that. And I got to see where the rabbit trail goes. Uh, there's so many threads I want to pull on, but I want you to go back to briefly. You mentioned this a couple times. A philosophy of science. So some people might not know what that means because it's putting two words together, but it's so important. What is a philosophy of science?
Oh goodness, that's actually not an easy answer, and there's so many different ways that I could define this for you. But
Yeah.
let me start with I'm having this image in my head of Michael Scott on The Office going, explain it to me like I'm five.
I love that. I was just watching The Office yesterday, so you're in good company.
Okay, so philosophy is really what we call in the philosophy world a magisterial discipline. Okay, that's just a fancy way of saying no matter what other discipline you're studying besides philosophy, there's going to be a philosophy of that field. And what we mean
Mm.
by that is you have to have in place your terminology, definitions of your terminology. You have to have your techniques. You have to have the ethics that govern the field of study that you're in, and so on and so forth. So when we talk about the philosophy of science, this would include, broadly speaking, things like what's considered good scientific method, what's considered a rigorous way to do research. And I could go on, but I hope that's giving a little bit of a picture. So it's this philosophy of science would be uh, the a body of knowledge that informs how we put science into practice. And so, as you can imagine, that's very worldview influenced. So
Yes.
if you're coming at the scientific enterprise from a scientific materialist worldview, which scientific materialism would be its own philosophy, right? It's philosophy of reality. If you're coming at the scientific enterprise from that worldview, it's going to influence how you think science should be done. For example, it will influence the kinds of conclusions you are willing to entertain when it comes to a problem. One famous example in the intelligent design versus materialism debate would be, well, when we look at the world and we see these these patterns that display a very specified kind of order, should we or should we not be able to conclude that there is intelligence behind nature? The scientific materialist would say no, that is out of bounds. Whereas the non-materialist, let's say a theist of some sort, would say, yeah, we should be able to entertain that as a hypothesis to explain the data that we're observing. So that's just one very narrow example of what we mean when we talk about having a philosophy of science.
Right. Well, and you mentioned having colleagues in previous roles where, well, how do you combine faith with science? Well, really, the question is, well, given the assumption that God doesn't exist, how can you bring that with your faith. So they're bringing a philosophy of science into the question that you can only discover materialist things. So how do you make that jive with faith, right?
Yeah,
If
exactly.
I had Dr. Lacona on a couple months ago, and we talked the same thing about history. That if you have a philosophy of history that rules out miracles, well, then of course the resurrection is impossible. But if you're at least open to the possibility and you allow the evidence to go where it leads, then you say, "Oh my word, the best explanation of the facts is that Jesus rose from the dead." So sometimes your philosophy of what you're doing, whether it be history or science or sociology or whatever, psychology, it will limit your ability to do that practice well because you might rule things out before you even begin. So this is why having a proper philosophy is so important.
Right, right. And a good metaphor for this would be putting on blinders that make
Mm,
your tool chest much narrower than it would be otherwise. And it seems to me that even from the position of someone, let's say they're agnostic about whether there is intelligence behind the universe, it seems to me that if they want to apply the utmost intellectual rigor to the investigation they're carrying out, they would want nothing to be off the table, right?
mm.
Because if you're going to pursue it with the honest intention of finding the truth of the matter, then you would want to rule things out properly rather than just ruling them out a priori and saying, no, we're not even going to go there. We're just going to assume that that's not the proper conclusion, right? You'd want to
Hmm.
be able to follow the evidence where it leads, no matter where it seems to be leading.
Yep, yep. It's like a detective going to a crime scene and saying, "Well, we know it wasn't Jeff because he said that red stuff on his hands is ketchup, so we're fine." And it's like we might be missing something here. So I appreciate you sharing that. I did ask you a big question, so thank you. Uh, but I do want to go back to what you were kind of leading up to the point of how did the scientific revolution in this environment of Christian Europe, how did that arise? And I have often wondered, like, man, we made so much progress so quickly all of a sudden, and that didn't come from nowhere, right? So as you studied that question, what were the big things that contributed to that?
Intellectual history is one of these things that is always, always, always oversimplified.
Mm,
And I find that very interesting. We want to be able to characterize history in a way that we can just trace these neat little paths from point A to point B to point C, and we can give these neat little uh, answers, explanations for historical phenomenon that are tied up in a beautiful little bow. And it never, ever, ever works that way. And the reason it doesn't work that way is because we have this myriad of cultural factors and political dynamics and geographical limitations and flawed people with their own strengths and failings and motivations behind their actions. And so it's really hard to just simplify all that into this is why this happened in history. And a good historian will be very upfront with you about that. But with all that said, what we can do is we can do comparisons, we can ask penetrating questions about why this happened and happened where it did. And as you said, one of my questions that is central to a lot of the work I do is why was it that science rose in the context of Christian Europe or the Christian West? So, throughout my studies, both in my master's and doctoral programs and in all the studies I've done ever since, the picture has increasingly clarified for me. And that's very exciting for anyone that's a scholar of anything. You know, you finish a degree program and people on the outside are like, well, wow, you must really be an expert on XYZ. But the truth of the matter is you're not really. You've just become qualified to work towards becoming an expert on XYZ. So over the years, over the past, let's see, I finished my doctoral program in 2019. So it's been about 6 years since then. And the amount that I've learned about this particular topic since finishing school is more than I learned throughout all of my years of graduate school. And that's how it's supposed to be.
Yes.
So anyway, going back to my original train of thought, what the picture that is becoming increasingly clear to me is showing is that, as John West likes to put it, I'm going to throw in a John Lennox quote here. John Lennox is very fond of saying, men expected there to be laws in nature because they believed in a lawgiver. So that's just a cute, pithy way of putting one of the elements that contributed to this rise of science in the Christian West. You had men with a theistic worldview who believed that nature would be rational. We only had to discover that rationality. And the reason nature is rational is because the Creator had a plan for creation that was discoverable to the creatures made in his image. And so let's just go back as far as Nicholas Copernicus. We could actually go all the way back to the pre-Socratic philosophers, and I do that. If anyone is familiar with my book, Thinking God's Thoughts, I actually start as far back as you can go. But let's just go back to Nicholas Copernicus. Let me dispel a common myth right off the bat, and that myth is that Copernicus discovered that the Earth moves around the sun rather than the sun moving around the Earth. That's actually untrue. Copernicus inherited what we call the Aristotelian Ptolemaic cosmology, which was geocentric, the Earth at the center with the sun, moon, and other known planets revolving around it. There were no new observations that convinced Copernicus that this wasn't a true model of the universe. Rather, and this is really important, Copernicus looked at the geometry and he did not believe that this mathematical scheme of the universe best reflected the mind of an all-powerful, ingenious creator of the universe. And that's why he devised a heliocentric scheme, sun at the middle with the moon and the planets revolving around. And he even wrote in his famous book On the Revolutions of the Heavenly Spheres, he said, nothing could better reflect the mind of our artistic creator than this. Who would put this most lovely lantern, and he was talking about the sun, anywhere else than where it could illuminate all things around it? And he goes on and he says more specific things about why he thought the heliocentric model was a much better reflection of the mind of God. Now, the point here is that it was an intellectual beauty that motivated Copernicus to hypothesize heliocentrism. It wasn't data. It was only intellectual beauty. And he was motivated then to do all the hard work of working out this complex geometrical scheme. And another myth that I need to dispel at this point is this long-running idea, and you even hear Neil deGrasse Tyson say this sometimes, that one of the things motivating Copernicus was he wanted to simplify the geometry of the reigning cosmology. And actually what Copernicus did not simplify things. That's a historical myth. Owen Gingerich, who was a historian of astronomy and an astronomer at Harvard University up until his death not very long ago. I think he died just a couple years ago. He was emeritus professor by then, of course. He has done a lot of excellent work on that particular historical myth, if anyone wants to look that up. So we have Copernicus. He's hypothesized this revolutionary, no pun intended, this revolutionary model of the universe. And that was the intellectual inheritance of Johannes Kepler. Kepler was enamored with the beauty of the heliocentric system as well. But the difference between Kepler and Copernicus was that Kepler was absolutely enthralled with what we would call the Pythagorean Platonic philosophical tradition. And part of that intellectual tradition was this idea of nature being thoroughly mathematical. And Kepler took that to a bit of an extreme. Okay, so long story short, he thought that he could fit a Platonic geometrical scheme into cosmology so that not only would it explain distances and sizes, but it would also explain why we have the number of planets we have. That's a more meta level question, right? That's not a measurement question. That's a why question. And it would explain how we can account for an intellectual resonance and an aesthetic preference resonance between the mind of man and the mind of our maker. So he went on this long circuitous intellectual journey from these things that he became utterly convinced about. And by the way, it turned out his scheme was completely wrong. Heliocentrism turned out to be true, but all these explanations that Kepler worked on turned out to be wrong. But then it was through his mistaken model that he ended up discovering his laws of planetary motion. And there's this wonderful preface to book 5 of his big fat book called The Harmony of the World, where he says, I have finally brought to the light this most majestic, wonderful, beautiful plan of our Creator God. And then he says, and I love his humility, because he says, it is not the way I originally devised in my previous work, but I am so excited I was wrong. Now I'm paraphrasing, but that's essentially what he's saying. Nothing could have delighted me more than to be wrong and find out the truth, because the truth is so much better than I could have imagined. And he talks about it in aesthetic terms. So he means intellectual beauty. And what's so interesting about it is that it was the pursuit, the decades-long pursuit of intellectual beauty that got him there. This wasn't, oh, I'm carrying out scientific experiments, or, oh, I'm cataloging all these scientific observations and I'm able to build a better model. No, this was all philosophical. This was all Kepler chasing the beauty of the mind of God. And so he ended up with his 3 laws of planetary motion. Those turned out to be very fundamental to the work several decades later of Sir Isaac Newton. And so Kepler was very much this linchpin between ancient astronomy and a true astronomical physics that came to more fruition with the work of Sir Isaac Newton. And so if I could sum all that up to give at least just a partial answer to that question, why then and why there? Why did science emerge in the Christian West? It would be because these great men like Copernicus and Kepler, and I'd say Kepler really most of all, they were in pursuit of knowledge of their creator. They wanted to be able to think God's thoughts after him because they believed that that very thing was an act of worship. And they were so devout in their faith and so desirous of a deeper knowledge of God, that they were motivated to pursue these things for decades and decades. And by the way, remember, this is before there was even any such thing as an electronic calculator. These are
Mhm.
men doing this work with pencils and parchment. Kepler never even owned a telescope. I think that's the
Wow.
saddest thing. He had
Yeah.
terrible eyesight and he never owned a telescope, but yet he made the biggest strides of his time in the field that we now know as astronomy. So
I love how you summarize that, and obviously in your work you go into much greater depth and detail and show the lineage of all of the building blocks. To your point, where it all led to that. But to summarize it as they were pursuing God is really quite wonderful, and that's why I titled this webinar "The Beauty of Science," because they were looking for elegance in their theories. And if God designed it, then it must be uh, desirable and beautiful and wonderful and marvelous and all these things that are typically void of science. In today's world, it's very compartmentalized, to your point. Uh, I remember when I was at HBU, and one of the reasons why I love that class or that program is it was very interdisciplinary. And we were reading C.S. Lewis's Ransom trilogy. Some people call it the Space trilogy, but it's the Ransom trilogy. I learned that one. And when in reading that, Out of a Silent Planet, there's just these little hints where Lewis is he's kind of taking digs at the modern mood that goes to today, of how science is very cold and data, and he was describing space as a place that is typically thought of as a place of death and void and cold and all this. And yet the main character found himself in this space shuttle looking out the window going, wait, this place is beautiful, and sort of discovering God there. And I think that talking about the stars as the heavens, like it always was talked about until recently, in sort of our modern mood. Um, but to integrate and to say faith and science are both exploring who God is. It's just different methods.
yeah.
Theology or science, we're thinking God's thoughts. I love that.
Yeah, yeah. And for those that don't know, I actually did not know this about Johannes Kepler until I was neck deep in dissertation research. But he would not only was he a great natural philosopher, which is what we would call men and women of that period who studied nature, great natural philosopher, key to the scientific revolution, but he was also an avid theologian and he wrote extensive poetry. So that just goes to show
Wow.
you how, he was thoroughly what we today would say classically educated, very steeped in the Greek paideia. So he did not compartmentalize. And I think that that was one of the key factors in his intellectual formation that led to his understanding of the study of nature and his grand discoveries.
Yeah. Okay, so I want to spend a few minutes, and if you're watching live, we're going to have a little bit of Q&A at the end. So if you have a question, drop a comment in the chat below. Like and subscribe, all the YouTuber things that you're supposed to say. Okay. But I want to spend a couple minutes because here we have the scientific revolution. It's sort of led by these men who are pursuing God. What happened then, as far as how did we get to today, where now we're compartmentalized, and it seems like we're not able to pull all of the threads together. It's in different boxes now.
So, going back to my very early point in our time together today, pinning the blame on one particular event or intellectual movement is impossible to do. But what we
Mm,
can say is that as our knowledge of the natural world increased, some of your viewers may have heard this phrase, the mechanistic worldview.
mm,
So we have these mathematical laws of nature coming to light, particularly with Kepler and Sir Isaac Newton, and with Robert Boyle, the father of chemistry. And we're seeing how very mathematical the world is, which again, Kepler and Galileo and Newton, Copernicus all saw as reflections of the grand rationality of the creator. But we're seeing all of this cause and effect mechanistic um, workings of the natural world. And it set in motion, or I guess I should probably say, because there's nothing new under the sun, it really ramped up this philosophical movement towards a naturalistic understanding. Well, everything's just matter in motion, it's cause and effect, one domino hits another, and so on and so forth. And we don't need the hand of the creator to explain what it is that we observe in nature. If we look long enough, we'll find a law and we'll figure out the cause and effect, etc. And so you have Enlightenment thought that comes along and exacerbates that line of thinking. And then, of course, we have in the second half of the 19th century, Charles Darwin doing his work on the theory of biological evolution by natural selection. And his work was very much used as just one more reason or one more bit of support for this idea that nature is this autonomous entity, that there is no need for a mind behind the universe. And so we just have this grand divergence of naturalistic thought. Um, and it wasn't justified. That's the thing. And I think one of the most wonderful things that we're seeing today in what has been referred to frequently as this renaissance we're seeing in Christian philosophy in particular is that we're seeing this whole new spate of arguments for the fact that, okay, you cannot even justify the existence of science outside of a theistic framework. Gavin Ortland, whose YouTube channel I follow pretty closely, he was just talking about this a few days ago. And I'm so
mm,
glad that we're seeing this. I like to use the word reawakening. We're seeing this
mm.
reawakening in philosophical circles of the fact that Enlightenment thought about metaphysics, about what exists, has failed, and that we're getting people who are willing to take a fresh look at a theistic or at least a non-materialist worldview.
Sure. Yeah. I've seen chatter, and I'm sure you have too. Alex O'Connor saying people are looking at God, and he's been a very outspoken atheist, and for him to say that is interesting. I've noticed people just, yeah, there's an openness. I think that people are possibly coming to the end of what results from a materialist worldview. There isn't hope in that either. And I wanted to add one thing to what you said about just how we got here. I think that you are right that it's a lot of different things. Um, I think there could be a practical, pragmatic side of it too, where as we've come to learn things in order to specialize and make progress in a field, you have to know a lot about something that's very particular. And so you see researchers dig a mile deep into an inch wide hole because that's the only thing that hasn't been dug up yet. And so people are having to specialize so specifically in order to write a dissertation or something. So uh, it But I think that it's all of the things that you talked about, and then I see that too. It's just fascinating.
Yeah. So it goes right back to the point we were discussing earlier about the compartmentalization of learning. And you have all of these brilliant men of science who were educated in that compartmentalized way. So they
Hmm.
haven't had training in philosophy, far much less theology, right?
Right.
And so I think, as you said, I love the way you put that. As people are coming to the end of what a naturalistic worldview can really give them, they're starting to look at the world with fresh eyes, with a new kind of inquisitiveness about reality. I loved that book that came out not very long ago by Justin Brierley, The Surprising Rebirth of Belief in God. I think that's the title,
Mhm.
right? I
Yeah.
would encourage everybody to get a copy of that. I am just so fascinated with what really seems to be a turning of the tide, and I think science is playing a part in that. I'm part of the formal intelligent design movement, formally speaking, and I'm seeing that in all sorts of different circles. People are starting to ask new questions. Well, they're not new questions, but
Right.
they're newly asking questions that we've wanted them to start asking. And then
Yes.
going back to my mention earlier of my interest in this discipline that's being referred to as the science of human happiness, that's where we see a strong connection, because we have people seeking for things like the meaning of life and the key to human flourishing. And within a naturalistic framework, they are not finding satisfactory answers. And so I would say that psychology is yet another science that is starting to have some movement in it back towards a classical theistic understanding of the world. Um, and for those out there who are fans of Jordan Peterson,
Sure.
I love dissecting his lectures and interviews for some of exactly what I'm talking about.
Yeah. Yeah. Or another example, Wes Huff. He's all of a sudden, and I'm sure you have also been familiar with him for years and years, and then all of a sudden he makes a YouTube video, you know, kind of debunking, someone's crazy views on ancient literature, and he was invited on Joe Rogan, and away he goes. But I think there's a hunger for depth.
Yeah.
I think there's a hunger for uh, an alternative to the hopeless and aimless worldview that the West has right now. Um, and I think that people like yourself or like Wes Huff or like, these different people who, when you ask them questions, there's substantive answers. People say, oh, Christianity has an intellectual tradition that I can't just throw away because of memes like Sky Daddy that were popular 10, 15 years ago.
Right.
Uh, I feel a tide shift, and people are less dismissive, and it's really encouraging.
Yeah, it really is. I thought I had a book immediately handy that I could show. Oh, I do. Hey, I'm going to go off screen for just a second to grab a book. Don't go away.
Grab it. Yeah. Yeah.
Okay, so there's a book. So this is Dr. Katie Mack. She's a scientific materialist, and she is a professor of astrophysics at the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill. And let me just tell you that the price of this book is justified by the epilogue alone, because
Hmm.
she admits some of what we're talking about
Wow.
coming to this realization that the universe is finite, that the human race is going to go extinct, and that there will be nothing at the end of all things. There will be nothing. And she is very candid about her existential angst over this reality. And she interviews other people in her field, and they're having similar feelings of angst about it. Like, this is really depressing. And one of the colleagues that she interviews says, when I give lectures on how the universe is going to end, I have had people in the audience just break down and cry because it's so
Wow.
sad. It's like, really, is this all that there is? Is there nothing? Is there nothing to give us an objective value? And so on and so forth. Now, in previous decades, you'd see scientific materialists write a whole lot about what I like to call meaning projects, where they'll say, "Oh, we can make meaning in our lives and glean a
Yes.
sense of value and significance. And isn't that wonderful?" And that is failing. That is failing people, because deep down, what they want, and this is how philosopher Joshua Sechrist at Notre Dame puts it. He says, it is not a sense of meaning in our day to day life that we're really after. Ultimately, what it is we want is an objective, bestowed meaning on our lives, something that is um, immovable and transcends this material world, something that gives us an eternal significance and value and meaning in our life. And you're not going to get that. The term that he uses is architecture. He says, within the
Hmm.
architecture of naturalism, that is not to be found. And you can work all you want inside the house of naturalism, building all of your furniture and all of your hanging all of your beautiful paintings on the wall. But at the end of the day, that's going to collapse. What you really need for ultimate human fulfillment is something much broader, something eternal and limitless,
Yes.
which is only to be found in a creator God. And
Hmm.
so as you can see, I get very excited about this, and that's why it's my current pet research project, because I think
Yeah.
there's so much to mine here, where we have, like Dr. Katie Mack, we have these astrophysicists who are
Yeah.
really waking up to the existential problems of their worldview, but they are brilliant people of science. And I
Hmm.
think that this is an area where Christian philosophers and theologians can really start to capitalize.
Absolutely. Your story brought to mind. I was in Colorado a few years ago. I was just seeing some pictures on Facebook of memories of that, being out there with Tim Stratton and Adam Coleman, and met the he's not called the Faithiest Atheist anymore, but my friend Richard, and being out there with students and doing this evangelism and apologetics training with Maven. And we brought in the Humanist Club from the uh, the Boulder, Colorado, University of Colorado campus Humanist Club, and they came in, and my students asked them questions, and they kind of gave their presentation. Here's why we're alive. Here's the meaning of life. These different things, and my students, because they had their radar up, they were listening to the answers. Like, wait a minute, these are all sort of, you know built from nothing purposes that. And so they asked the question to each one of the panelists, what's your purpose in life? And I'll never forget one of the gals, sweet old gal, but she, a part of the Humanist Club. And so she said, my purpose in life is to be a grandma. And all of my students said to themselves, that's a good thing. But what happens when you're gone and your grandchildren are gone and no one remembers you? And I remember debriefing with them, and they were all realizing that desire for an eternal purpose, exactly what you're saying, that none of that's going to last. And they just had this realization, like, oh my word, that our worldview answers this question so fully and completely and in a satisfying way. And so, yeah, just wanted to share that story. Just
I
popped
love
into my
that.
brain.
I'm very
Yeah.
encouraged by that. I want everyone to be thinking about meaning and purpose and value and what those things mean for human flourishing.
Yeah, absolutely. Well, we're about out of time. And so want to just give you the chance if you have anything else to say. I would encourage people to go purchase your books. I have a couple of them, I believe, linked in the description. So please go check those things out. You can find them wherever books are sold. And yeah, do you have any other work online or where can people follow you?
I do have a website. It's melissacaintravis.com, and I try to keep that up to date as well as I can. I do have two publications coming out in the next several months that I'd like to highlight. First of all, in August, there is a volume coming out called Understanding Christian Apologetics, and it's one of those counterpoint style volumes where it's me and four other scholars, and we are essentially debating in print the best approach to Christian apologetics. So be on the lookout for that. And then February 1st of 2026, I have a co-authored book coming out entitled The Reconstruction Project. My co-author is Dr. Andrew Ike Shepherdson. He does some teaching at Colorado Christian University as well as Denver Seminary.
Yeah.
And what we did in that particular book was to write 12 standalone chapters, and each chapter is dedicated to a popular reason cited by people who go through a faith deconstruction process. And it's really targeted at seminary and graduate students, but we worked hard to make it accessible to even a layperson. So I would say it's not popular level, it's not high academic level, sort of in between a semi-academic treatment of these topics. So this would be for people that really want to see the receipts, right? So, it's fully footnoted and has an extensive bibliography to back up all of the chapters where we answer these 12 common objections that play into these deconstruction accounts. And I'd like to invite all the ladies who might be listening to September's Women in Apologetics conference that's happening right outside of Dallas, Texas this year. And I will be speaking. My HCU colleague, Nancy Piercy, will be giving a keynote. I'll be giving one of the parallel sessions, and I'll be speaking on the existence of the soul, which is another pet topic of mine. So I would encourage all the ladies to go to the Women in Apologetics website and check that out and try to come out and see us in September.
Yeah, yeah, great plug. My wife went to that in Nashville last year and really enjoyed it. So it's a good
Oh,
time.
good.
You get together with like-minded people and rub shoulders. It's a good time. So
Good, good.
yeah, absolutely. All right. Well, that concludes our webinar. Thank you so much, Melissa, for coming on. I really appreciate your time.
My pleasure.
Really
This was
enjoyed
so
our
fun
conversation.
just to get to geek out with you about all the things that I love to talk about.
Yeah. Oh, absolutely. Very good. Very good. Well, I will make sure to have those things linked in the comments below. So if you have would like to learn more, and I wanted to ask you too, uh, are you going to be posting or where can I find about your happiness project? Because I'm so interested in that.
Oh, well, just stay tuned. I've done a couple of articles related to this for Christian Research Institute. So if you go
Hmm.
to the Christian Research Institute, their website is equip.org, and you just type in my name, Melissa Cain Travis, in the search bar. It'll pull up a list of articles that I've written for them over the years. And there are a couple on there. One of my most recent ones actually is on this topic. And then there's an older one that I did. And I'm sorry, the exact titles of the articles are escaping my mind at the moment, but they'll be really easy to spot. So those are sort of my preliminary ruminations on the topic, but I would very much like to, in the next couple of years, start working on a full-length book manuscript on the topic. I have a lot of research left to do before then, but at
Yeah.
least I'm getting a little bit of stuff out there.
Good deal. Well, I will be on the lookout for that. Well, thank you so much, and thank you for watching. Of course, you can always drop a comment, or please like and subscribe and share this video if you found it helpful, and we'll see you next time.
Yeah, thank you so much for having me, Richard. This was a pleasure.